I think it was from Rabbi Goldstein.
The sticker is sticking?
Racist.
No. So what?
I have to move away.
You can sit there.
Of course.
Did you get a call from Marvin at the Weinstein? He got his daughter's coming. He wants to see if he can get on the reservation for tomorrow. I think we're out tomorrow. He said, I have no idea, but you're gonna have to speak to Andrew, so he may call.
Okay. Like I ordered the food, I paid for the food.
Okay.
The check was brought.
Okay, I'm just wondering what's.
It's upset with it. The Mefarshim find reasons to say that they didn't sin. When he himself said,
Then I'll tell you my idea.
I would come to the dog.
you can't do it when somebody says I sin. Not the big sin.
My opinion is that
You know, everybody else has partial sheets and this and that.
Why is the biggest all right.
Okay, if we can,
okay, so what is the subject?
He did, but the rest was he did. Not that I'm speaking of, but everything go into
okay, anybody on there on Zoom yet? Okay,
No.
where? For what? The one that's marked for women and one that's marked for men. So long as you know what gender you are, you're okay.
We'll see, I guess.
Right? Okay. Just want today, not really,
Okay.
because you should have it already,
Oh, didn't he
Okay.
give that?
right? And if not, I have a few extra.
Rashi on
I
something
think I
servant,
gave
is that
it
it?
back.
No, we did that at the end. I'm going to finish that. We did at the end.
Something out last week?
I gave out Rashi and the suffering servant.
Yeah, I do not have that.
You don't have this one?
So which one are we?
Right, that we covered last week.
Thank you.
Which one are you?
I gave it back.
In my answer.
I remember giving it.
This one?
Yes, I gave back everything I had.
Thank you.
All right.
Which one?
Is there another one?
You don't know which one you're talking about.
Okay, so let's.
I don't know, I'm asking you which
I
one.
don't have extra copies of
What's the subject? What's the heading there? Which one do you have? What's the heading?
Okay,
Okay.
so we'll get started with our bracha.
He doesn't have, you don't have any more? He doesn't have any more.
No, that's okay.
That's it.
We'll
I
give
didn't know.
All right. I have
next
that
week.
at home.
I have them at home. I'll bring them on.
I have it
Okay.
at home.
All right, so I want us to start with our bracha, and then we'll sort of pick up where we left off last week, and then we'll move on, all right? Okay, so let's start. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay, we took at the end of last session, we took the suggestion that the Sharashevsky had made, okay, where basically he claimed that if we looked at a section of Rashi in the book of Isaiah, okay, and spoke about and said that he claimed that he felt that was where it was clear that Rashi attempted to defend the what had happened during the crusade, and well, not defend. In other words, it was a defense of the Jewish people, in a sense, of what that occurred. And in doing so, he said it pointed out that their choice of death, as opposed to conversion, was a clear message to the crusaders and to the mobs and things like that.
It says, Yarek Val Yavo.
Okay, that's true, but the crusaders didn't learn that.
But
Right.
the Jews did.
The Jews did, right?
It's not meant for the
Okay.
Crusaders.
So his point again was that Rashi actually was using certain language to get around any censorship, and that the fact that the Jews were tortured and killed during the Crusades because they refused baptism and did not want their ethical values to be on the same level as those of the Gentiles. Now, someone asked last time about the number of crusades. Okay, there actually were more. There were a total actually of 5, but tonight, or at least today, I want to tie in what we read about that first crusade, okay, because we saw the map, okay, we saw the students' report, that was what we were reading. We read from Solomon Bar Sampson, a, so to speak, eyewitness report. But I want us to connect the fact that the initial impact of that first crusade on the Rhine communities of Worms and Mainz and Speyer, places like that, was so significant, okay, that those areas Jewishly, if you will, did not come back, if I can use that term, till almost 2 centuries later. Till almost 2 centuries later.
Did they go all the way to Jerusalem, all the way to?
To the Crusaders?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
All the way to,
Yeah.
But we're going to add to that another example, okay? So one of the things we want to think about for a moment is that to what degree did that first crusade in particular, but the other crusades impacted on the quality of Jewish life, number one, and number two, even more so, the relationship that was going to be between Jews and Gentiles in what we would call Ashkenazic Europe, okay, France, Germany, that area, okay?
You mean during the Crusade?
As a result of that first crusade primarily, and then the other crusades as well. Okay? So again, Sharashevsky is going to make his argument, and we can then decide, will we agree or will we disagree with his view? Okay? Which is also focus more on the issue of to what degree some of Rashi's commentary, like we saw with Isaiah, or like we would see if we went into depth in the Tehillim, okay, was really a anti-Christian polemic. Okay? So by doing so, I'm going to suggest that Grossman also is telling us, besides Sharashevsky, that the interaction, the relationship between Jews and Gentiles changed markedly after the First Crusade and the later Crusades, okay? If we think about it, what we talked about, that prior to the First Crusade, we said that there was a lot of interaction on commerce, in business, even on a social level, particularly where Rashi lived in Troy, okay? But not just there, between Jew and Gentile. They used each other's businesses. They were commercial. Jews would sell products to non-Jews, okay? And remember, we referred to the fact that one of the key issues there was the selling of wine. Jewish merchants who had these kinds of vineyards, okay? How could they really sell wine, their product, to Gentiles if they knew that the Gentiles were going to be using that wine for their own rituals, for the church, okay? And Rashi, we said, disagreed with some of his teachers, indicating that he gave a heter, he gave permission for Jewish merchants to sell wine to Gentiles, even though they knew that they were going to use it for what we would consider idolatrous activities. Okay? Right? So just from that example alone, we would know that at the time of Rashi, early at least, okay, that the relationship between Jews and Gentiles was fairly significant. There was economic collaboration. There was Jewish involvement in certain trades, commerce, finance, mining, okay? There was, as I said, social interaction. Yes.
Are you saying that the common man, the commoner Jew and the commoner Christian were able to coexist?
Exactly.
But
But even more than coexist. Okay? In other words, you had a wedding. You as a Jew, felt that you could invite your non-Jewish neighbor to that wedding.
So it was coexistence of common man, not the hierarchy?
That's the question. That would be a good question, because to what degree did the hierarchy even mix with the common man, right?
By starting the Crusades. Who started the Crusades?
Well, that's the point. The Crusades, remember, the participants in the Crusades were on two levels. I'm going to phrase it this way. Level one was the nobility, all right, who figured that number one, they could get rich or richer, and number two, they could have their penance, and the lower group was the mobs, the average people, okay, who felt, number one, they were going to get penance for whatever sins, and maybe they might get rich. Okay, so there was the rationale, the motivation for participating in the Crusades was, while may have been both of those aspects, it weighed differently between the commoner, the feudal system of the poor, and the well-to-do, the elite, the feudal lords. Okay? But what middle class that there may have been, okay? So that was the issue. So they would invite non-Jewish neighbors to weddings, to funerals. Okay? There was a level of, that's why I said, certainly coexistence is a good term, perhaps even more than just that. Okay? What happened then with the First Crusade? Okay? The mobs, who did they attack? The Jews. And even though there may have been some church authorities who supposedly gave protection, when the going got tough, they were the first ones out the door. Okay? So the end result was Jews really had minimal protection. And that was what we read about in that whole report, in that story in my aunt's, that eyewitness account. Okay? Jews began to fear for their lives. Okay, they sought the protection of the local church authorities. They thought that they would intercede on their behalf with the Crusaders, but they were not very successful.
Was there any attempt at self-defense?
Much there was, okay, very clearly, okay, that, but who did the Jews really wind up fearing most? Not the, let's say, upper class, the lords, the nobles, things like that. It was the mobs. It was the peasants, okay? They were primarily interested in exploiting Jews financially, okay? What they could break into somebody's house and steal, or they would kill and then take over, things like that. And we're going to see that in a few minutes today with an example from a second crusade. Okay? Now remember, we're saying this was primarily the Rhineland. So Rashi physically, okay, and the Jews of Troy in that area, they were not impacted, so to speak, physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Okay? Remember, this was the community, wines, worms, etc., where he had learned as a young man, where he would have had colleagues, where he would have had friends that were still there. Okay? So the danger of the peasants then was the fact that they would listen to some charismatic leader, okay, that he would encourage them to attack, that sometimes these attacks were spontaneous, okay? And yes, the Jews tried when they could to fight back, okay? But basically what happened is if they went into the synagogue, okay, to protect, or they were on the property of the church, these mobs would still go ahead and carry out their attack. So Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, these places where the great yeshivas had been of Rabbeinu Gershon, they were seriously impacted. Okay? As a result, okay, if you no longer had a center of learning in northern Germany, where did the center of learning become?
The south.
Okay, no, not in Germany.
Oh, fine.
It moved to France. So here's where we begin to see, again, the rise of, ultimately, which we'll talk about, Rashi's progeny, okay, his grandsons and others. And so France, central and northern France, now became the main center for Jewish learning.
The Crusades did not affect France?
I didn't say that. Yet we're going to see another example where it does affect them, okay? Because not every crusade took the same route. They weren't always going in the same direction. We're going to get to that in a few minutes when we talk about the second
Did
crusade.
they have a special direction, those crusades, or they just went?
Right, the first crusade, we said clearly the goal was
to
go towards
Israel.
Constantinople, okay, go towards Jerusalem,
Jerusalem.
etc.
That was
Okay.
the main.
right? So we now see, right, so northern France
Jewish people there.
becomes the center for Jewish learning, okay? And I'm suggesting that this is the part of the impact of that first crusade. Now, this is a different source that I found that I wanted to share because this is an encyclopedia's evaluation of the same situation. Although crusades continued over the next 300 years, subsequent crusades, argued this encyclopedic article, did not affect the Jews in the same way. After the events in the Rhineland in 1096, the church realized the importance of reining in the popular armies and protecting the Jews. During the Second Crusade, the preaching of Bernard of Clairvaux, the moving spirit behind the crusade, condemned anti-Jewish preaching and actions. However, Bernard's rationale demonstrated that anti-Jewish sentiment was alive and well. Now, this is an encyclopedic article. It's not a Jewish author. Okay? For Bernard, the Jews were living witnesses to what happened to Jesus. Their dispersion throughout the world served as proof of their guilt and of Christian redemption. Okay? So this is I want to call it unbiased, but I would say certainly for a non-Jewish encyclopedia, okay, to have an article to evaluate this situation, as I've just shared, tells us something about the change of the Jewish status as of what we would call Ashkenazic Europe. Okay? And the shift, number one, in terms of a place of centers of learning. And number two, what would happen, what was going to be the relationship between Jews and Christians from that point on in the Middle Ages and continuing, I would say, through up to even modern times. Now, to clarify, if you will, or to give added proof to that statement, okay, what I'd like to suggest is in the handout that has the first page, the Crusaders in Mayence, we go to the last page, okay, which is entitled, and it's a very short one, Rashi's Grandson and the Crusaders. It's the last page of as I said, the handout that had as the first page, the Crusaders in Mayence. Okay, and I'm going to read it since it's really a short piece. And again, this is taken from Jacob Marcus's classical work, The Jews in the Medieval World. Okay, Rabbi Jacob ben Meir, known as Rabbeinu Tam. Okay? We will talk about him in more detail, but we should know that he was a grandson of Rashi, and he was considered one of the leaders of Jewish community in that generation. Okay?
What was he called Tom when his name was?
Oh, we're going to see that. I'm going to talk about that. We'll get to it. Okay? Okay? Was nearly a victim to an anti-Semitic mob. Now, this is the Second Crusade, which is approximately, remember the first one was 96. This one is 1147. That's what, roughly 50 years later. Okay. All right. The writer Ephraim ben Jacob is sure that the hand of God was behind Rabbeinu Tam's good fortune. May 1147. This is 51 years later, okay? Not in the Rhineland, but in the middle of France, central France. Okay, are people chilly? We can adjust the.
How does it change?
It depends on what it's set at.
Somebody changed in the beginning, not in the middle.
On the second day of the Feast of Weeks, notice when they chose to attack. Okay, Shavuos, where the Jews are going to be. What? Either in their sukkahs or, no, Shavuos. Shavuos, where are they going to be? In Shul. Okay, the French Crusaders got together in Ramaru, entered the house of our teacher Jacob, may he live long. Where did they go into? They entered the synagogue. Okay, but in this case, not the synagogue, they entered his residence, his personal residence. Okay, and took everything he had then, and even tore up the scroll of the law in his presence. They got hold of him, led him out to the fields, condemned him because of his religion, and conspired against him to put him to death. 5 times on the head they wounded him. And in doing so, they said to him, "You are the greatest man in Israel. Therefore, we are taking revenge on you. We are going to wound you just as you Jews wounded our God." Okay? His pure soul would have left him had it not been for the kindness of our Creator, who had mercy on his Torah and brought it about that a high official who was to prove of help to Jacob should be on the road that led through that field. Rabbi Jacob called to him and bribed him with a horse worth 5 gold pieces. The official then turned and appealed to the Crusaders and pleaded with them, saying, "Leave him to me today. I'll talk to him. Perhaps he'll be persuaded so that we can bring him to our faith. If he doesn't consent, rest assured that I'll turn him over to you tomorrow." They did so, and the danger was avoided. Because God had compassion on his people, he was merciful to him who taught them his holy Torah. Okay? So in other words, here's an example that during the Second Crusade, okay, and this is already back again in France, okay, attempted what happened to Rabbeinu Tam, who was one of the leaders of the Jewish community, okay, and only because of this bribe, this situation, did he survive, okay? Now, what we want to understand then, number one, it became France, northern France, middle central France, became a new center for Jewish learning. Number two, okay, that the attitude that what happened in the Crusades clearly changed the relationship that would exist between Jews and non-Jews throughout Europe.
It's obvious.
Okay. Now, let's ask our third question. What about the Jewish community? What about Jewish learning? Okay. Were there newest yeshivas established? Where there's a continuation of Jewish learning? Okay. It may have been that economically, okay, and socially, Jews suffered. That clearly seems to be the case as a result of not only the first, the second crusade and others. Okay? But I would suggest to you that Jewish scholarship, that learning, that the study and interpretation of Torah and of Talmud and of Jewish law continued under the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Rashi and other students, their students and Rashi students. Okay? And this is what we're going to begin to talk about over the next couple of sessions. Okay? That following the First Crusade, church leaders, as that encyclopedia indicated, realized that there was a value to trying to protect the Jews, to condemn the anti-Jewish preaching. Okay? But in the popular mind, the common people, right? The peasants, the dispersion of the Jews throughout the world served as proof of their rejection of Jesus and of Christians, and showed Christian superiority. In other words, as one of these historians said, anti-Jewish sentiment was alive and well and would continue in Ashkenazic Europe for centuries to come.
So
Yes.
basically, what the new church leaders were saying, we want the Jews around so we can oppress them.
We want the Jews around because A, we need their money, okay? Because further crusaders needed money to pay for the ships, to pay for the animals, to make sure that they would get their armor. Okay, so we needed Jewish money because who else was the money lenders? Okay, one of the reasons, by the way, that Rabbeinu Tam will talk about became so significant, not just as a Jewish leader, but in general, was because when the rulers needed money, who did they go to? Okay. He was involved in finance, he was involved in viticulture, things like that. Okay. So they needed that. Number two, okay, the other aspect is who you're going to convert. If you want to show the superiority of Christianity, it meant you had to convert somebody, right? And you had examples of converts. And in fact, some of the apostates, Jews who left Judaism and became converts,
They still believe and do that.
were, no, they were probably, many of them were the worst in terms of trying to convert other Jews and involvement of the church. Okay. So we're now going to get to what I would call our, so to speak, our last unit. Okay. And our last unit deals with what is the lasting influence of Rashi and his, so to speak, descendants and his students. Okay. And I would start by an interesting comparison. And this Grossman does make an interesting argument. He says, if you were asking Sephardic Jewry, who would you say would be the most outstanding personality of the Middle Ages? Rambam, exactly. Clearly, it would be that the Sephardic Jewry would claim that the scholar with the most lasting influence would be Maimonides. So if medieval Ashkenazic Jewry would ask the same question, who would they say?
Rashi.
Rashi. That's what Grossman argues. Okay, now that would seem, remember we had many significant rabbis in 12th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century. Okay. We had famous rabbis who contributed greatly, okay, to Jewish learning. Okay. In fact, Malcolm Morris in her shiur on Thursdays has been talking about a number of those individuals. Okay. But whereas Maimonides, his contribution was clearly in what we call Jewish thought or Jewish philosophy or halakha, we would have to ask what then was the contribution of Rashi and his students and his progeny. There we would say it has to deal with three areas also. One, biblical interpretation. Two, Talmudic and halachic inquiry. And three, tefillah, prayer, liturgy. Okay, those three areas. Okay,
He didn't translate the Siddur. What do you mean?
we're going to see. We're going to see it. Okay, all right, you're going to understand why I say that momentarily. Okay, now Grossman argues it would be very difficult to really say whose influence was greater between Maimonides and Rashi. One left us with books that define the perimeters of Jewish theology and observance. The other, the explanation of existing texts that opened up new worlds of understanding for generations. Okay. So let's think about Rashi, focusing back to him. And if we said that there were three areas, I want to, again, try to say why those three areas: biblical interpretation, Talmudic analysis, and tefillah, prayer, liturgy. Remember, I talked some time back, I mentioned to you that the late Dr. Abigail Rock had written a lot on Mefarshim. That was her specialty. Okay, she taught not only individuals, but in general, Parshanut. Okay, right? And so she argues the following. Why do we see Rashi as what was called by later generations Parshan Data, the document, the explainer par excellence? That's what later authorities called him. Okay? It's interesting, she argues, that really Rashi wasn't the very first to begin this approach of explaining the text more on a pshat level. Okay? She suggests, instead, that there was somebody prior to Rashi, Rabbi Menachem Bar Chelbo. Okay? But most of his work was done on books of the prophets and books of the writings, Ketuvim. He's not well known. You're right. Right? But the approach of focusing on Pshat may have been initially started by him. Okay? And she argues that he bases this approach clearly on the Talmud, where the sages of the Talmud, the Amoraim, argue that, and she quotes, nothing can override the primary literal meaning of the text. Pshat takes precedence. That is the argument she suggests. Okay? So why then do we look to Rashi? If there was somebody prior to him, okay, what was it that made Rashi so significant, as if he was the father, right, of that approach? Okay? Again, she says primarily because of his commentary on the Chumash, on the Torah. Okay?
Yeah.
Now,
He brought the pshat and the drash.
well, that's what we're going to get to.
That guy did not
Remember?
write on the Torah.
All right. So
He didn't write the Pshat, a Perush on the Chumash. Torah?
who?
The,
Chalbo? No, not that we have.
so what did he write on?
Nach, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Rashi became known because others who attempted to do that we don't have their texts as, okay? For example, she was another gentleman who, and he was known as Maha. He also wrote, okay? He was a resident of Troy, all right? In the Gemara, they call him Talmid Chaver, okay? He's a younger colleague, but a student at the same time, okay? Rashi, and in fact, he would write Yeah.